RealAgriculture.com presents Frontlines, geopolitics affecting agriculture with Jacob Shapiro of Bespoke Group and Real Agriculture's Shaun Haney. Welcome to another episode of the Frontlines podcast with Shaun Haney of Real Agriculture and Jacob Shapiro, who is the Director of Research with Bespoke Group. Jacob, how are we doing?
We're doing pretty well. It's not the silly season for summer yet here in New Orleans. I've got at least another week or two before it gets too hot, so I'm feeling fine.
Yeah. Well, it's just a volume of stuff happening right now from a geopolitical perspective. Of course, a lot of these geopolitical issues have an impact on what happens in the commodity market that works its way to farm gate profitability. Things that are happening, on the other side of the world somehow do have impacts on farms across the U.S. and in Canada. Speaking of Canada, Canadian election. What's the geopolitical take there? What's your read on Mr. Carney becoming the next Prime Minister of Canada?
Yeah, so obviously I'm here in the United States, so I'll give you the American point of view or the American analyst point of view. What a massive own goal for President Trump. When Trump was first elected, it seemed like he really had his finger on the pulse. He basically pushed Trudeau finally out by forcing the issue there, and it looked like the Conservatives were finally going to have their moment in Canadian politics. And then by continuing to hammer on about the 51st state and all of these, all the different things with tariffs, it seems to me like Trump basically handed it to Carney and handed it back to the liberals, who I didn't think had a chance even a couple of months ago. And most polls say they didn't have a chance a couple of months ago. And it's ironic because if Trump hadn't done that, and if it had been the conservatives, that probably would have been a government that would have worked more closely with the United States, would have been more aligned maybe on USMCA renegotiations. There could have been a better relationship there. And instead, by continuing to hammer on this 51st state nonsense, I think President Trump has basically just guaranteed a Canadian government that's hostile is a little strong, but is not just going to bend the knee. Canadian nationalism has been awoken. I think that's part of the reason for the result. So obviously, it's not all because of external issues. I'm sure there are internal Canadian issues to which I'm not following that closely. At least from where I sit, it seems to me that President Trump actually shot himself in the foot. That by pushing too hard, he actually gave support to a Canadian government that's going to be more competitive with him and less willing to deal with him on a long-term basis.
Well, and in fact, actually endorsed Carney and talked about a couple times how he really didn't like the conservative leader. He couldn't even remember his name, if I remember one time what he had said, which was just very interesting. He had mentioned something that didn't really stick is where he talked about how he found it easier to negotiate with liberals, which I thought was an interesting offhanded comment that he made there as well. Canada's kind of in an interesting spot because of the adjacency economy, so tied to the U.S. and it really a lot of countries around the world are envious of that. That ability to do so much business with the largest economy in the world. But on the other hand, talking so much about, hey, how do we diversify our trade and try to do business with more countries around the world? That seems to be the thrust right now. Canada looking to is Europe our friend? If America's not going to be, is it Europe? Is it Asia? It's surely some. It can't be China. That's not a great relationship, but the best. Even the worst of times. So it's kind of a fascinating time for Canada on the global stage, I think.
Why can't it be China? I mean, if we're rechecking assumptions and things like that, everything is clear. The question for Canada is what is the pain tolerance going to be for the Canadian population? Because if you really do want to diversify, if you really do want to reduce significance on the United States, and me sitting at my desk here in New Orleans, I can tell you all the reasons that might be a good reason in the abstract, but that's going to mean economic pain. I mean, we're talking about 80% of Canadian trade with the United States. We're talking about infrastructure that for decades has all been pointed south because it's U.S.-Canada relations was sort of what everybody had faith in. So there are tons of options out there for Canada, but it's going to involve short-term pain and a lot of investment, a lot of long-term strategic thinking. And is Carney the guy who's going to have enough support to do those kind of really big changes and weather the pain that is going to come from having to make those changes? I don't know. The election didn't seem like a landslide or anything to me. And Carney, it seems to me, has some of the same problem spots that Trudeau did on his record. It's going to be tough to get a large majority of Canadians to sign on with him and push forward with him and push through all these other different things. So I think ultimately, I think this is true of Canada and of Mexico. An old Mexican dictator from the 1910s and 1920s, Porfirio Diaz, is alleged to have once said, "Poor Mexico, so far from God, so close to the United States." Mark Carney could say the same thing about Canada. You sort of have to make your choice about whether, okay, we just have to deal with this, or we're going to make some really tough decisions to try and say, better relations with Europe, or maybe we have to have more pragmatic relations with China. Maybe we can use our relationship with India to do something. Maybe we can have better relations with South America, but it's going to be difficult based on how much investment there's already been in the U.S.-Canada relationship.
Yeah, and I'm kind of leaning more to the former. I think we could actually see more integration and more business done with the U.S., especially as the U.S. kind of forces countries to potentially choose between itself or China. And speaking of the U.S., what's happening? What's happening there? It seems like President Trump's kind of running up against some I guess challenges in terms of trying to make some of these things happen as quickly as he would like on the geopolitical front.
Well, in some sense, it's eerily like his first term. You have competing factions within the administration, and whoever has his ear last is sort of what he goes with. But then, if you can get him in a different room, you can convince him to do something else. You can see like Besant and Miran on one hand sort of have their view of things, and they were sort of a more gradual approach, using the threat of tariffs to renegotiate deals, creating these blocks that some were going to be allied with the United States, others would be less so. Then you like define rivals. And then you have the Navarro Lutnick guys who are just out there and they just want to break everything and tariffs and the whole nine yards. And you can sort of see these factions like doing battle, and you can see the ambivalence coming out of the White House in terms of policy. And I think when we're thinking about the long term, I think at a certain point, it doesn't matter what the strategic goals of the Trump administration are. The haphazard and incompetent way they have tried to implement policy over the past 3 to 4 months has sort of created a fait accompli of itself. Because even if, and I could make the strategic argument for the goals that the Trump administration has talked about, the tactics have been so botched that you have even countries like Japan that are coming out and saying, we're not going to do anything to jeopardize our relationship with China. If the United States asks us to do something like with that, we're going to say no. That's Japan, which is arguably more dependent on the U.S. security relationship than almost any other country in the world besides Canada. So I think that's really the constraints have become clear, and the constraints have become clear because over the last month we saw the dollar fall, we saw the bond market riot in response to some of these tariff policies. The poll numbers look terrible for President Trump. There was a particularly disturbing poll earlier this week that showed he's just hemorrhaging support from Hispanics. That support was a large part of what drove him to victory last November as well. Economy contracted officially last quarter. It's probably contracting this quarter. I'd be shocked if the United States was not already in recession, and things are probably going to get worse from here. Even if you get a return to normalcy in U.S.-China ties, and it looks like both sides are pushing that direction, just look at all the shipping data. Look at the absolute drop off in imports and things like that. It's going to be a tough quarter or two. And you can only blame Biden inflation for so long. Like Biden was a long time ago at this point, guys. Like they're not the ones that broke the economies. There's a lot of economic pressure, a lot of pressure coming because of some of the decisions that they've made. And it's going to force if not more normal policy, it's going to show us that a lot of the superficial drama that's been created is not actually going to be followed through on.
It's easier to ask Canada and Mexico to choose a side than it is Japan and Australia. Like to ask Australia to choose America and just stop doing business with China. That, like again, adjacency. That is a very, very big ask. And the problem on the other side of that is, even if you said, okay, we're going to do this. This is, you know what? Just ideologically, this is the right thing to do. We're going to choose the U.S. over China. Can you trust the Trump administration to not somehow use that against you in terms of negotiating their own deal with China? I think that is one of the pieces that is not talked about enough or understood enough inside the United States.
Well, and this is where the tactics really matter. Because let's say it wasn't Trump and there was no Navarro and there was no Lutnick or any of those others, and Besant was the one calling the shots. You probably would have gotten some version like this, where they would go to Australia and Japan and say, look, our long-term goal is to isolate China. We recognize that China is your biggest trading partner right now. So over a period of 5 to 10 years, we want to see you reduce your dependence on China, increase, dependence on the United States, relocate manufacturing, all these other things. If you don't do X by year 5, tariffs increase this much. And if you don't do X by year 7.5, then tariffs increase by this much. And if by 10 years you're not meeting quotas, then it's going to be embargoes, full things. That's a coherent policy. And that would have given those countries time to reassess themselves. It would have given them something to hang on. Maybe it even would have been productive for them to relocate supply chains and think about things more seriously. Instead, what you got was tariffs across the board. Everybody, tariffs for all of you. And it's 10% this, and it's also up to 200% on China. And if you don't come bend the knee, and if you don't start buying long-term US treasuries and all these other things, it's going to be terrible for you. You won't have access to US. Like none of those countries are going to be able to do that, to your point. Like it's not a hard thing that they're asking those countries to do. It's impossible. It would be like asking Canada to stop trading with the United States. That's what the level of economic exposure for an Australia, for a Japan, for a South Korea is to those countries. It also, just sort of belies a certain lack of awareness about what the trade relationships look like. For instance, Bessent said earlier this week in an interview in the Oval Office that the South Koreans came with their A game, that they were going to be one of the first ones
Yeah,
to
he
probably
did.
get a deal because okay, there's already a free trade agreement between the United States and South Korea. Like they came with their A game because there's nothing they have to do to bring their A game. They can just say, great, like we won't have tariffs on the things that we already don't have tariffs on. What else would you like from
See,
us,
this is the
White
thing that
House?
this is the thing that I think President Trump is so good at is like the showmanship of like we negotiated a deal, we changed maybe a couple paragraphs of a 100-page document, and we got a new deal. We're ready to go because that he is very good at this part of this of the communication of what may or may not even happen, even if there's like little change. Some said that about the NAFTA renegotiation and USMCA, that it kind of fell into that. There was things that changed, but not like it wasn't this monumental rewriting of the agreement that was fundamentally that much different than what was there previously.
You're right that he's very good at the showmanship and controlling the short-term media narrative. But in the long term, that's going to have negative consequences because by doing that with a country like South Korea, inside South Korean policy circles, the internal monologue is saying, we can't trust these guys anymore. So we have to do whatever we can to preserve the relationship right now because we can't afford to break it right now. But this is not an aberration. Like this is something that is a long-term threat, and we're going to have to change the way that we do things to reduce dependence in the long term on the United States. So you're trading a short-term PR win for long-term loss of trust in the US market. And that's why I think it's really important to ignore some of the headlines and to look at so what deals are actually getting done and what is the dollar actually doing and what is where are treasury yields? Are people selling US treasuries or buying US treasuries? They're not buying, they're selling. So you can already see that there's a lack of trust that's been injected into the system. And at what gain? If the gain was a truly unified bloc that was going to isolate China, okay, even if you disagree with that, you can make a good faith sort of very reasoned argument for why that might be something that is good for the United States in the long term. But you're not getting a block of countries that is now unified with you. You're getting really erstwhile allies who are like, we can't trust this guy. And what's going to happen next? And who's going to be in control of this next? And what's the next thing they're going to ask for? And they're just going to threaten tariffs when they ask for something else that is not in our best interest. Like it really does undermine the trust in those relationships.
I don't think you're going to get much disagreement from many people. Most people want to see some sort of peace between Ukraine and Russia. They want this to end. Now, how that happens, that's where there's sides develop, and who needs to give up what, and who needs to claim victory versus loss. President Trump has been very set on trying to get peace between Russia and Ukraine. Is he gaining momentum in that? Is that a failure at this point? Is it just going to take longer than they thought? How would you describe it?
I've been fairly consistent on this, and this would have been true if Kamala won the election too. I think Trump has accelerated it a little bit. Ukraine's future and the future of this war is not dependent on the United States. It's dependent on Europe. those decisions are going to be made in Berlin and Paris and London, and it's not going to be defined by what Washington was going to do. Trump tried to have his, brand of deal making to bring this to an end, and he couldn't get, there was that scene in the Oval Office with Zelensky, which didn't end up going anywhere. It was again to your point about showmanship. I don't know
Yeah.
if you watched the end of the clip at the very end of the diatribe against Zelensky, like Trump turns to the reporters and says, "Well, that was good TV, wasn't it?" It was
Yeah.
good TV.
Yeah.
Everybody turned it on and watched it. But Ukraine, like, okay, so they signed a minerals deal and they're working on it and they're trying to do all the things the United States wants. In the meantime, Putin didn't give Trump anything that he wanted. I know that they have now since, offered a 72-hour ceasefire, but, they're negotiating with Trump's guys and they're saying, yeah, we want not just Donetsk and Luhansk, but we want Kherson and we want Zaporizhia. We want all these other different assurances. And that's not going to work. It was never even going to work for those in the White House who wanted some kind of accommodation. So I think the story here of Russia, Ukraine is really that, Ukraine is not going to surrender and that the Trump administration, because of how it went directly to Russia rather than telling its allies about what it was doing, and also basically launched a trade war against Europe at the same time, encouraged countries like Germany and like the UK and like France to say, okay, like the US is not going to do this. We're going to have to do it. And the Germans have announced major increases in, sending military aid to Ukraine going forward. So has the UK. You've got German arms companies buying factories off of German car companies so that they can make more tanks and more shells and more artillery to do these different sorts of things. So if Vladimir Putin is willing to make a deal that says, okay, I just take Donetsk and Luhansk, and otherwise we sort of freeze the conflict there, yeah, then Ukraine probably makes that deal, and Europe is probably pushing Ukraine to make that deal. But if Putin continues to go with this expansionist, I want Kherson and I want Zaporizhia and I want assurances that Ukraine is not going to be armed and I want to make sure Ukraine's not in the EU and all these different other things, it doesn't seem to me that the Europeans are going to force the Ukrainians into that, and that that's not a position that's tenable for Zelensky going forward.
If
So
you had to
I
put
think really,
if you had to put money on it, 3 years from now, are they still fighting?
that's a great question. I'll tell you, in 3 years they might be fighting again. I think probably you get to
Mm.
some kind of resolution, and that both sides arm as quickly as possible, and then probably the Russians try to do it again. Like that would be my base case would be a frozen conflict for the next 3 years, and maybe you get another leg up if the Putin regime is still around. Like I think probably Putin has longer than 3 years he can hold on, but as we learned during the Prigozhin incident a couple of years ago now, like it's not like Putin is all powerful, and it's not like this war has not had consequences for the strength of the Kremlin.
It We saw what happened with Americans in they, as you've described, kind of lost interest in this conflict or war. Um, how do people in Germany and France, if they're going to have to float this financially, how do they view it? Because they're closer to it. Are they more inclined to be on side that we don't want Russia coming over our borders either?
It depends which European country you're talking about. This is one of the challenges for a group like the EU. If you're in Spain, you're like, what do we care? We're not importing Russian oil at huge scale. It's not like the Russians are going to get all the way to Spain and threaten Madrid. Like we don't give a crap. If you're the Poles or if you're the Estonians, you care a lot because
Yeah.
this is not academic for you. It could come straight through. And if you're Germany and France, you're trying to keep the EU together. And so you have different views on what this is going to look like. So I do think that the average European, since President Trump was elected and pushed through with these trade wars and reached out to Putin directly, I think the average European has woken up and realized, oh, like the relationship with the United States has changed. And it is important for Europe now to be sovereign from a defense perspective and to not be so reliant on the United States going forward. And it would be better to keep the Russians bogged down with a Western Ukrainian buffer state between Russia and Eastern and Central Europe than it would be for Ukraine to be overrun. I think the future, if you're an optimist, the future of what is left of Ukraine that hasn't been taken by the Russians looks a lot like Israel. A country that is not formally in any military alliances, but has been armed to the teeth by the West and has a very, very competent military that can hold the line. And that would be a best case scenario for European countries, because then you get to invest all that money in arming the Ukrainians. You get to have paid all that money to rebuild Ukraine. And you can do it while making sure that there's a buffer between you and any potential revanchist threat from Russia coming out. So I don't know that the average European thinks that way. Probably the average European is taking a siesta or having a nice glass of wine or something like that. But European policymakers and the people who are making those decisions, I think like there's been a sea change in the relationship with the United States, and you've seen definite moves towards, okay, like we need to be prepared, because if we can't at least show that we can stop Russia at this particular place, it's just going to encourage Russia to go further. Like Russia was never going to stop at Ukraine. Russia's geopolitical imperative is to extend at least to the Carpathians, at least to reclaim some of the lands that were under Soviet influence, and then probably to keep pushing forward. That's what the geopolitics of the Northern European plain has been about for literally centuries.
Yeah. One of the things that's off the geopolitical beaten track for the common observer is some of the things that's happening between India and Pakistan right now. Pretty concerning. Get us up to date.
Yeah, all of the sort of Trump flooding the zone with information, I think, has obscured some of the really important things happening in the world. There was a terrorist attack in Kashmir last week, and in response, and it was looks like a Muslim group, although who claimed, like, we don't have a firm claim on who claimed the actual attack itself, but about 26 people died, and they were singled out for their religion. They were Hindus. Even reports that, the attackers were asking very specific questions to see what religion they were, and then killing the ones that they knew were Hindus. And it's not particularly abnormal to have violence in Kashmir or, pot shots between Pakistan and India, but this has gone a good deal beyond that. India suspended the Indus Waters Treaty, which is a treaty that's been in place since 1960, which has survived three different wars between India and Pakistan, and basically is what allows Pakistan to get access to like 80% of the water that they use for agriculture. India suspended it, and you had Modi, leader of India, come out and say the military is cleared to defend Indian interests and to retaliate. You've had Pakistan saying they have intelligence reports that an imminent attack is coming from the Indian military. So this is, 1.5 billion people roughly total, two countries with nuclear weapons, and they're squaring off against each other right now. And you've got reports on the ground that, yeah, maybe they are preparing for serious military conflict. And you've gotten some very clear diplomatic signals that are much stronger than anything we've seen in the recent past, whether it was the similar terrorist attack in 2019. It didn't lead to this level of disruption. Not even the Mumbai attacks in 2009 or 2008? I forget. But the Mumbai terrorist attack around the time where almost 200 people died in India, that didn't lead to a suspension of the Indus Waters Treaty or of India and Pakistan, ending relations with each other and all these other different things. So I think this is a huge hotspot that we need to watch going forward, just based on how things are going.
And maybe I've watched too many movies, but my perception would be that some sort of conflict between these two countries would escalate very quickly. Is that?
Previous versions have not escalated that quickly. So there have been three, maybe four wars, if you want to call it. They're more like skirmishes between the two sides, and they've been relatively contained. But anytime you're in war, like, all it takes is one errant missile or one trigger happy commander to make things go in a very different direction. So yeah, when you have two nuclear powers squaring off against each other like that, it's really concerning. And it's also, we live in this multipolar geopolitical context right now. So China has a lot of economic interest in Pakistan and has been backing Pakistan a good bit. JD Vance was just in India a couple of weeks ago. Yeah. Russia's running around here too. Europe is negotiating free trade with India. So you get to the chance of, is this going to be a proxy conflict, or great power is going to be intervening or pushing on one side or the other to try and move things? Like, all these different things create a bad cocktail for us to watch. So my base case is not that there's going to be some huge India-Pakistan war, but yeah, when two nuclear powers with 1.5 billion people are going through what looks like it could be a small war and could, completely upend how they've dealt with water and agricultural resources for literally since the 1960s. Like, yeah, you should sit up in your chair a little bit and notice it, because that is signal. That is not noise.
Yeah, that's amazing stuff, man. I really appreciate you breaking it all down for us, Jacob. Thanks so much. Thanks. I look forward to the next episode of the Frontlines podcast.
Me too. We'll be back with you soon. Unfortunately, the world is not going to give us any shortage of topics, I think, to address. So.
Absolutely not. If anybody has any feedback, questions, comments, you can send me an email, shaney@realagriculture.com. Cheers, everybody.